What's up, Minecrafters? KC here, and welcome to episode 10 of my modWorld series. I'm looking at 3 trees that I grew from saplings, and I wanted to study these trees because I'd like to have the ability to easily grow additional trees just by tapping my magic wand on the ground. I grew these 3 trees specifically because I wanted to look at them and understand how they look, what their structure is. So just by looking at this, I can see that trees come in 3 different heights, but they have some characteristics in common. For example, they are all 5 by 5, or at least the leaf layers are 5 blocks by 5 blocks. Although the corner blocks, sometimes they have leaves on those 2 lower levels, and sometimes they do not, like here. And then just above those 2 levels, there's 2 additional levels that are sort of in a plus shape if you were looking at the top of the tree or above the tree and looking down on the tree. You would see leaves in a plus shape. And then the final characteristic that I see is that there is the top layer of leaves that cover up the wood part of the tree. So understanding that, I think it will be possible for me to generate trees that have these characteristics. Again, the 3 different heights, some randomness to the corner blocks of the trees where they may have leaves, may not have leaves, and then the upper 2 layers there with leaves as well in that plus shape. So that is something I'm going to begin working on with my magic staff. So I'm going to switch over to my code editor. So the first thing that I want to do is I want to have the ability to place my staff into, let's call it tree mode, where tree mode means that if I tap on the ground with my magic staff, let's say I tap a grass block, that would grow a tree if I have turned tree mode on. So I'd like to be able to toggle that off or on. So I'm going to create a variable to store the state, if you will, of tree mode, and I'm going to default that to false. And how I will toggle that tree mode off or on would be through proc cmd. And you can see here that I have already added a little bit of code for that. So basically, if I type in the word tree mode into the chat window, it's going to set tree mode equal to not tree mode, which would set it to true or set it to false. And then I'm giving some feedback to the screen. If tree mode is true, I'm going to say tree mode is on. Otherwise, I'm going to say tree mode is off. But that allows me to set tree mode on or off for my magic staff. So the next thing I'm going to focus on then is the ability to tap that ground block and generate a tree. So here I'm going to check in the use item. I already know at this point that I've tapped a block with my magic staff. So if the block ID is 2, which is a grass block, I am going to call a new function here called doBuildTree. And then finally I'm going to call preventDefault. Now I want to pass in the X, Y, and Z coordinates to buildTree because I want to build the tree on top of the block that I tapped. So I think that's all of the code that I need here to check for tree building. Actually here also I want to check and make sure that tree mode is true before I do that. So when I tap a grass block and I've toggled tree mode on, then I want to do the build tree. So I think that's what I want to check for there. Next, I'm going to begin creating that function that will actually build the tree. So this will be function doBuildTree. And again, this is going to accept as parameters the coordinates where I'm going to construct the tree of X, Y, and Z. So the first thing I'm going to do is I want to define through code the structure of a tree. So the way I'm thinking about it is like this. If you were looking at a tree, again from the top, and looking at that very bottom layer of the tree, closest to the ground where it has the tree trunk or the wood block in the middle, again, that's a 5 by 5 area. So let's just say that to represent that area where the trunk is, I have 2 blocks of no leaves, or nothing there. And then I would have a wood block, and let's call that wood block, let's just specify that or designate that with a 3. So 3 means wood, just in the way I'm defining my tree here. And then 2 additional blocks of nothing, or an empty space there. So that would sort of represent that area around the tree trunk. But again, this is a 5 by 5 area or space that this tree takes up. And so moving away from the trunk of the tree, there are no leaves on the ground. So the tree, again, looking at it from the top, would look something like this. And this is, again, the lowest layer of the tree, the one that's just above ground level. The only block that I really have there is the tree trunk. So I'm going to use this type of structure or scheme to specify what a tree looks like. And again, this would be the ground layer. So I'm going to begin building up now the rest of that tree. And so I'm going to create a new variable to store that. I'm just going to call it def for definition. And I'm going to have a line of text here that represents each level of the tree that goes up, very similar to what we just looked at. So again, the row of blocks furthest away from the trunk would be 5 zeros, which again, a 0 to mean is going to mean there's nothing there. And then I would move sort of to that next row, and again, that's going to be 5 zeros because there's nothing there. And it's 5 again because we're dealing with a 5 by 5 area. Then the next row would be the row that actually contains the tree trunk. And so again, I'm going to use a 3 to represent that wood block. And then I need to define those next 2 rows, which are just like the first 2 rows, where there's really nothing there. There's no wood, there's no leaves or anything. So that would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 zeros. And then finally, that final row, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So that string, so far, represents the very bottom layer of my tree. Now, when I was looking at trees earlier, I determined that they can be of different heights. And the tallest of those trees had basically 3 of these identical layers. There would be 3 wood blocks with no leaves around them representing the trunk of the tree. And then we would get into the tree itself. So I basically here just need to copy that, and I'm trying to get my code to line up. I would need to copy that again. And so again, the only thing I have at this point is the 3 wood blocks. And then I would begin defining my leaves. So those 2 bottom leaf layers, again, as I said, there's a little bit of randomness to the corners. There may be some leaves or there may not be some leaves on those 2 on those 2 bottom layers. So again, there's that randomness on the corners. So I'm going to use a 1 to represent the fact that I may or may not place leaves on this corner block. Then the next 3 blocks, I definitely want to place leaves. And so I'm going to use a 2 to represent that. So a 1 means to me that I will need to sort of randomly determine whether or not I want leaves. And then the 2's mean definitely place leaves. And then another 1 here, again, it's going to sort of represent the other corner of this row of leaves. And so again, I'm going to put a 1 there because I may or may not have leaves there on that corner. Then thinking about the next row behind this, that would be all leaves. And then I get to that middle row where I'm going to have leaves, and then my tree trunk, which again is represented with a 3. And I think I've got just 1 extra character there. So that may be correct, although it doesn't look like it's lining up properly. So let me think through this again. So I have a corner, then I have leaves, and then I have maybe again another corner where I may have leaves or not have leaves. And then I am going to, maybe there's just an additional space there, so let me take this out. I think that's what's happening. I'm just going to space this over. I like for this to line up properly. So I think that's correct. So again, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 represents that column or that row. And then leaves, leaves, trunk, leaves, leaves. And then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, because I have all leaves on that next row. And then I get to that final row, which would be sort of on the back side of the tree if we're facing it. And there would be a random leaf, and then 1, 2, 3 leaves, and then another random leaf. Then basically I just want to duplicate this because there was 2 layers of leaves on that bottom section. So 2 layers where there's randomness on the corners. And then I begin defining the top 2 layers. So the way those top 2 layers worked, the first row would contain 5 empty blocks. And then I would have 2 empty blocks, and then I would have leaves, and then I would have 2 empty blocks. So now that's the second row. The third row would have no leaves, and then leaves, the tree trunk, and then leaves, and then no leaves. And then, let's see, the next one would be no leaves. And then finally, the 5th row back would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 again, of just totally empty spaces. So that represents the first of the 2 upper layers. And then the final top layer of the tree is identical to that, except we don't have that wood block in the center. So I'm going to use a 2 there to represent the fact that I want to place leaves on top of the wood block that is the trunk of the tree. So this should define a tree. That may seem a little bit confusing the way I've defined it. But again, each line here represents a full layer of the tree. And it should be 25 characters long because it's 5 blocks by 5 blocks. I'm using zeros to represent the fact that I don't want to place a block there. A 3 means I want to place a wood block. A 1 means I want to randomly generate leaves. A 2 means I definitely want to place leaves there. So I think just looking at this, that is what I want for specifying the structure of my tree. So now given that, I want to process that information and build up the tree. So just sort of thinking ahead here in terms of what I need, I'm going to create a new variable for an index value, and I'm going to default that to 0. And what this variable is going to represent is how far into this string I am as I'm interpreting it and building the tree. So index is sort of an offset into that string that I'm going to work through. Now I need to think about my coordinate system a little bit. I'm going to define a new variable here called y1. So I have y being passed in, and the x, y, and z values here are the values of the block that I tapped. So I want to build my tree sort of on top of that block that I tapped. And so y1 is going to represent the layer that I'm working on as I build my tree. But I need to set that to y plus 1 because, again, I want to build on top of the block that I tapped. Now, the next thing is I need to take into consideration the height of the tree. I may generate a short tree, a medium-sized tree, or a tall tree. So earlier I said that my IDX value represents the offset into my definition string. But I need another variable here, and I'm going to call this start I, and I'm going to set that to 0. And that's going to be important when I get into my for loops that are used to generate the tree, and you'll see shortly how I'm going to use that. So now I know that I need to consider the fact that I can generate 3 different heights of trees, and I want some randomness to that, so I'm going to create a new variable called rnd for random, and I'm going to set that to math.random, which I know returns to me a number between 0 and 1 with decimals. So I'm going to use that value to determine what height of tree that I'm creating. And so there's 3 different sizes of trees. So let's say that if that random number is greater than, let's say 2 over 3, or 2/3, then I'm going to generate a tree that is, let's say, a short tree. So if that random number comes back at basically 0.66 or higher, I'm going to generate a short tree. So what I would want to do there is I would want to set my starting position equal to 2, basically. Because what I want to do is I want to skip the top 2 definition lines here. And so I would begin building the tree basically from this point where my cursor is, which would be 1 wood block close to the ground, and then the leaves would begin on top of that. So that start I means basically that I'm going to be skipping those top 2 lines. I would also then need to set my offset or my index into the string there. And so I'm just going to set index equal to basically 50. Because index is starting at 0, I'm just going to say index plus equals 50, which advances my index into that string by 50 characters. And again, each one of these is 25 characters long. So again, that indicates that I'm skipping these top 2 and beginning at this point here that I'm selecting where my cursor is. So that is if I'm generating a short tree. Else, let's say if that random number is greater than 1 over 3, or basically 1/3, then I would generate a, let's say, a medium-sized tree. So I want to then sort of define my offsets, and so I'm going to set start I to 1 effectively by doing a start I plus plus, and then my index value I'm going to do a plus equal 25. And what that will do is effectively skip, or cause me to skip, this top line of the definition and start at the second line. And so on a medium-sized tree then, I would have 2 rows or 2 layers of wood blocks in the center only before I begin building my leaves. And then the final case here would be a tall tree, but my index value starting at 0 and my start I starting at 0 are already set up to build that tall tree. So I think that has given me the ability now to specify, or through a random number generator, specify whether I'm building a medium tree, a tall tree, or a short tree. So now I get into the actual building process for the tree, where I'm going to create the blocks through code. And I know I'm going to need to do that through a few for loops, specifically 3 for loops. So my first for loop is going to be iterating through the layers, or the height of the tree. And again, we're going to start at the bottom and build the tree from the ground up. And so I'm going to have my outer loop here, again, represent the layer or the level of the tree that I'm building. So where I'm using my start I value is in this for loop, because start is either going to be 0, it's going to be 1, or it's going to be 2. And again, that's just how many layers I'm going to build. And so here I will check to see if my loop variable I is less than or equal to 6, because 6 would be the tallest tree that I could have. Really it's 7, because start I could begin with 0. So let's say it's either 0 through 6, which is a total of 7, 1 through 6, which is 6, or 2 through 6, which is 5. So I want to make sure that I go through that number of times. And then finally I'm going to increment my I counter here. So again, that for loop is representing the layers or the height of the tree as I build that up. So next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to define a new variable called z1. And z1 is going to represent the z-coordinate where I'm going to place a block. So I've already thought through where my y is going to be, because I'm setting y1 equal to the block above the block that I tapped. Z1 is basically going to need to sort of back out from that center point. So if I tap a block, I'm going to place a wood block on top of that, but I need to move 2 spaces away from that to sort of identify that edge of the tree. And so I'm going to set my Z1 value to the Z that gets passed in minus 2. And again, all that's doing is backing away 2 blocks or 2 spaces from the center point of my tree. And at this point then, I need to go into another for loop, and I'm just going to use J for this. And J is going to go from 0 to 5, because this tree again is built in a 5 by 5 area. Actually, that needs to be a 4, so 0 through 4 would be 5 blocks. So J less than or equal to 4 and J plus plus. So what J is doing here is, let's say that that's going to represent the rows of the tree. So J, again, will iterate between 0 and 4, which would be a total of 5. So think of that sort of as building across in the layer that we're currently working on. So then inside of my J loop, I want to create a new variable to store my X coordinate. So I've defined Y already. I've defined the Z location. So I'm going to create a new variable here called X1 and do something very similar to what I did with Z and set that equal to X minus 2. And again, what that's doing is moving 2 blocks away from the trunk, but in the other direction from the Z coordinate. And then finally, my most inside loop, I'll just use K for that. We're going to start at 0, K less than or equal to 4, and then K plus plus. So now I have my 3 directions that I'm working in here. Y is the height, Z is the rows, and K is basically going to be the additional rows that are behind the row, if you will, that I'm working on. So now inside this loop, this is where I need to begin inspecting my definition and determine what I'm actually doing. So I'm going to do that inside of a switch statement. And what I'm going to switch or check the value of is the position out of my definition string that's offset by my index value. So again, the first time through, this could either be a 0, which would be the very first character of my definition line, or it could be a 25, which would be the first character of the second line that you see in the definition variable, or it could be a 50, which is the third line of my definition variable. So by doing the index value of def, I'm just pulling the character out of one of those positions. Then the next thing that I want to do is I want to determine what that character is. So I know that I need to handle case 0, which means there should be basically no tile placed there. And so I'm going to specify that by doing a level.setTile on my x1, y1, and z1 coordinates, passing in a block ID of 0, which again will mean place effectively an air block or even just clear that block. And then I will break out of my case statement for case 0. Next case I want to deal with is a 1. And again, the way I've defined that in my definition string, those would always be corner blocks of a leaf layer in the tree. But I've designated that to mean that I may put leaves there or I may not put leaves there. So because there's that variable I am going to generate another random number. So if math.random is, let's just say less than 0.5, which would be roughly a 50-50 chance of either placing leaves or not placing leaves there. So let's say if it's less than 0.5, then I'm going to do a level.set tile on the x1, y1, and z1 coordinates, and I'm going to put leaves into that position if that random number is less than 0.5, and 18 is the block ID for leaves. Else, I'm not going to put leaves in that position, so I would do a level.set tile on x1, y1, and z1, again to a 0 block, which would be a space or an air block in that position. And then finally I want to break. So this is creating the randomness that we looked at in the corner of the trees. Next case I need to handle is a 2. And again, a 2 to me will mean that I always want to place leaves in that position. So I'm going to do a set tile on x1, y1, and z1. And I'm going to definitely place leaves in this position. And so that would be block ID 18. And then the last case that I need to handle would be case 3. And again, to me, this means that I always want to place a wood block there. So in the x1, y1, and z1 coordinates, I'm going to place block ID 17, which again is a wood block. And then I break out of that case statement. And then finally, just for completeness, I'm going to have my default case, which really isn't going to do anything because I'm handling all the different characters that I could get out of my definition line. So just a quick review there. Case 0 means that's an empty space in the tree. Case 1 means there's randomness in terms of whether or not I'm placing leaves. Case 2 means I'm always placing leaves. Case 3 means I'm always placing a wood block. So that finishes my innermost for loop. So the next, or my my switch statement, but I'm still inside my innermost for loop where I'm going through the rows. And so here I will want to increase my index so that the next time through my switch statement, I'm getting the next character in the string. And then I also want to increase my x coordinate, so I move over to the next block to place the tile that I determine I need to place. That takes care of the entire for loop for sort of, let's say, going across the tree. Then the next thing that I want to do outside of that for loop, so this would be still inside my for j loop, I want to increase my z coordinate, which means I've completed an entire row of leaves, so I want to move back and begin placing blocks, let's say, just behind the row that I've just created. And then finally, outside of that loop, I want to increase my y1 coordinate, which is the height. So by the time I get to this y1++, I've generated one entire layer of that tree, so I need to move up a layer and begin building that next layer. So I think that's all that I need to do here. I'm accounting for the different iterations through of building the tree, the height, the width, and the depth in those for loops. In the innermost for loop, I'm looking at my definition statement and I'm determining what that is defining, whether it's an empty space, whether it's leaves, or whether it's part of the tree trunk. And then for each of those different cases, I'm placing a block in that position. So I know that may be a little bit involved and a little bit complicated, but if you come back and review what I've done, I think you'll see sort of how that's all hanging together. And it's really all being driven by my tree definition. And just working through that and determining whether or not I place a tile, and if I'm going to place a tile, where am I placing it within that 5 by 5 area of the tree. So just a quick review of that. That seems to be what I want this function doing. So I think at this point I will save my script. I know that I will go into my chat window and I'll turn tree mode on, and then I will tap the ground with my magic staff, and where I tap it, we will go into this function to build a tree there. So I'm going to now switch back over to Minecraft or Block Launcher, load my script, and then enter into Minecraft. So I'm back in Minecraft now. My script loaded successfully. I did not change or did not have to make any changes to the code I had written. So now I want to do some testing with that to make sure that it's working properly. So I think I'll just move over to sort of an empty space in my world here. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure that I can turn tree mode on. And it's indicating to me that that happened back through the client messages. So next thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to tap the ground and see if it builds a tree. And indeed it did build a tree. So through the randomness of the height, it determined that it should build a short tree. So you can see there's just one wood block on the ground. We have the randomness on the corners that we wanted. So for example, this corner has full leaves. This corner has no leaves. And this corner just has leaves on the top. And looking at the top of the tree, if you were looking down from the top, it would have that plus shape. And we do have leaves covering the top of the tree, or the top of the wood block on the tree. So that one seems correct. So I'm just going to try maybe another one here and see if we get a different height of tree. So here we generated another short tree, which again happened just due to the sort of the randomness of my function. Now here we've generated a tall tree. So this would have gone through that entire tree definition, and that looks correct. There are 3 wood blocks coming up off the ground. We have our 2 layers that are 5 by 5 with the randomness in the corners, and we have our tree top. So I'll try another one, see if we can get it to build a medium-sized tree, and it did. So there's a medium-sized tree. And again, that seems to have those same characteristics that we're looking for. So these trees are being generated all by my magic staff. And just going back and comparing them to the trees that I grew from saplings, you can see that they look very similar in nature. We have a tall tree like we do here. We have a couple of short trees like we have here. And then finally, over at the very end, we have a medium-sized tree, which is similar in nature to the first tree that I grew from a sapling. So that seems to be functioning correctly to me. I can generate different heights of trees. I have the randomness in the corners, and it looks very similar to trees that you may grow from saplings in Minecraft. So this will make it much easier for me to grow trees because I don't have to get some saplings, and I don't have to have either bone meal or allow the tree to sort of grow on its own. And I think that will allow me to more rapidly build my world. Now, one of the things I had done in an earlier episode with my magic staff, let me just toggle tree mode off. And now if I tap the ground, nothing's happening there because I don't want to build trees. But one of the things I had done just in one of the earlier episodes of this series when I established or built my magic staff was the ability to tap on one of these wood blocks and have it fully harvest the wood. So I wanted to just test that and make sure that that's working properly. So that seems to be dropping the wood blocks the way I would expect. So that all seems to be working as well, the way I expect. So I'm going to call that enhancement to my world successful. Switch it back to day mode here, where I now have the ability to place my wand into tree mode, tap the ground, and grow trees with characteristics that look like they may have been created by a sapling growing into a full-size tree. So again, I think that will be a valuable enhancement to my world. And thank you for watching this video. I know it was a little bit longer, but I wanted to go through that process because I may use that again in the future. Have the ability to specify structures and have them built automatically through code. So that was a valuable exercise for me to go through. So again, thank you for watching this episode. I've enjoyed creating it, and I look forward to the next episode.